30 seconds, Victor Laurent said, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the glittering hum of the International Horology Expo. And for the first time that day, the room didn't feel like a celebration of time. It felt like a countdown to failure as the $2 million timepiece in his gloved hands began to falter, its once perfect rhythm stuttering beneath the crystal chandeliers that poured light over polished glass cases and velvet-lined displays, where collectors and elites leaned in with quiet alarm, the faint scent of leather and lemon polish hanging in the air like something too refined to break. And yet it was breaking, right there on the stage, in front of cameras, investors, and rivals who had waited years to see Victor Laurent falter, even slightly, even for a second. But Victor didn't falter, not outwardly. His posture remained immaculate, his tailored suit unwrinkled, his silver hair untouched by panic. Only his fingers betrayed him, adjusting, recalibrating, moving faster than usual, searching for control in a mechanism that no longer obeyed. And then, from somewhere beyond the velvet ropes, beyond the polished shoes and curated confidence, a voice, quiet but unshaken, slipped into the silence. "You're adjusting the wrong gear." It didn't echo, it didn't demand attention, but it took it anyway, like a single note played perfectly in a room full of noise, and heads turned. Slowly at first, then all at once, toward the source, a man standing just outside the circle of importance, his jacket worn at the cuffs, his hands unloved, his presence almost an intrusion in a place designed to exclude people like him. Ethan Cole didn't step forward yet. He didn't need to. The space between him and the stage was filled with judgment already, with raised brows and quiet smirks that carried the same message spoken 100 times in rooms like this: "You don't belong here." And Victor heard it too. Or maybe he felt it, because when he finally looked up, his eyes landed on Ethan with a flicker of disbelief that quickly hardened into something colder, something practiced, a thin smile that had dismissed men before they ever spoke. "This isn't a flea market," Victor said, not loudly, but with enough precision that the crowd leaned closer, eager for the performance they thought they understood, the hierarchy they trusted, the outcome they expected. And for a moment, just a moment, Ethan said nothing, his gaze steady, his silence not empty but full, as if he were listening to something deeper than the failing ticks of a luxury watch, something beneath the surface, something no one else had thought to hear. And the watch, still in Victor's hands, gave another uneven beat, softer now, weaker, like time itself was hesitating. And in that hesitation, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would be right, the master surrounded by wealth and reputation, or the repairman no one had noticed until he spoke. The laughter did not come all at once. It spread slowly, like a ripple across polished marble, subtle at first, then sharper as a few well-dressed guests exchanged knowing glances, their confidence rooted in years of watching men like Ethan be wrong. And Victor Laurent allowed that moment to breathe, his fingers still resting on the delicate crown of the failing timepiece, his expression composed, almost amused now, as if the interruption had been a brief inconvenience rather than a challenge. And he tilted his head slightly, studying Ethan with the detached curiosity of a man who had spent decades deciding who mattered and who did not. "You believe you understand a mechanism you have not even touched," Victor said, his tone smooth, controlled, carrying just enough condescension to draw a few quiet chuckles from the crowd. And the cameras, sensing a shift, angled toward Ethan, capturing the contrast without mercy, the worn fabric of his jacket against a sea of tailored suits, the absence of status in a place built entirely on it. But Ethan did not shrink under the attention. He did not rush to defend himself. Instead, he stepped forward, one measured step at a time, until he stood just at the edge of the stage, close enough now to see the watch clearly, the fine engravings along its case, the microscopic tremor in its balance wheel, the nearly invisible hesitation that revealed more than any diagnostic screen could. And his eyes moved not with doubt, but with quiet recognition, as though he had seen this before, somewhere far from glass cases and velvet ropes, somewhere simpler, harsher, where mistakes were not hidden behind prestige. "It is not the balance spring," Ethan said, his voice calm, steady, carrying further than expected in the stillness. "It is the secondary gear alignment. It is overcompensating." And for a fraction of a second, something flickered in Victor's eyes. Not fear, not yet, but irritation, the kind that comes when certainty is questioned in public. And he let out a soft breath through his nose, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. "You are mistaken," Victor replied, more firmly now, reclaiming the room with practiced ease. "This watch has been calibrated by the best minds in the world." And that sentence settled over the crowd like a shield, restoring their belief in the hierarchy they trusted. But the watch, still in his hand, gave another uneven tick. Softer now, less certain, and the sound seemed louder in the silence that followed, because no amount of reputation could change what they were all hearing. And Ethan did not argue. He did not push. He simply held his ground, his gaze fixed on the mechanism as if listening to something deeper than sound, something hidden beneath layers of craftsmanship and pride. And then, almost gently, he spoke again. "If you keep adjusting it that way, it will stop completely." And this time, the words did not land as easily as the first, because the room could feel it now, the tension tightening like a wound spring, the possibility that something was not as perfect as it appeared. And Victor's hand paused, just for a moment, a hesitation so small it could have been missed, but in a room built on precision, even a fraction of a second mattered, and the cameras caught it. The stillness, the uncertainty, the first crack in a flawless image. And for the first time since the watch began to fail, Victor Laurent did not immediately respond. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the room like something fragile that no one dared to disturb. And Victor Laurent, a man who had built his reputation on absolute control, now stood with a decision pressing quietly against his composure, because the watch in his hand was no longer just a mechanism. It was a statement, and that statement was beginning to unravel under the weight of a stranger's calm certainty. And for a moment longer, he held onto his authority, his fingers hovering over the crown as if willing the timepiece to correct itself out of loyalty alone. But it did not. The uneven ticking faltered again, weaker this time. And the sound, once a symbol of perfection, now carried doubt through every polished surface in the room. And Victor exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that signaled neither defeat nor acceptance, but calculation. And then, with a measured motion, he lowered the watch slightly, just enough to acknowledge what could no longer be ignored. And his gaze returned to Ethan, sharper now, more focused, as if seeing him for the first time not as an intrusion, but as a variable he had not accounted for. "You have 1 minute," Victor said finally, his voice even, but stripped of its earlier amusement. And a murmur passed through the crowd, subtle but electric, because this was no longer entertainment. This was risk, and Ethan did not hesitate. He stepped forward onto the stage with a quiet confidence that did not seek permission, only opportunity. And when he reached Victor, he did not look at the man, not immediately. His attention went straight to the watch, to the delicate structure of gears and springs that lay beneath its flawless exterior. And for a brief second, his fingers hovered just above it, not touching, simply feeling, as if listening to something deeper than sound, something hidden beneath precision and pride. And then he spoke, softly but clearly. "It is not failing. It is compensating for a misalignment it should never have had." And without waiting for agreement, he reached in, his movements precise, controlled, entirely free of hesitation, and the room leaned closer. Without realizing it, drawn into the quiet gravity of someone who did not perform, but understood, and Ethan gently stopped the rotation, a motion so deliberate it felt almost ceremonial. And for a heartbeat, everything paused, the lights, the cameras, the breath of every person watching. And Victor's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to realization, as he watched a man with no title, no recognition, handle a masterpiece as if it were something familiar, something solvable. And Ethan made a single adjustment, small enough to be missed by anyone who did not know where to look, but exact enough to change everything. And then he released the mechanism, stepping back just half an inch, not claiming the moment, simply allowing it to unfold. And the watch responded, not instantly, but with a quiet, steady return, tick, tick, tick. Each movement clean, precise, restored to the rhythm it had lost. And the sound filled the room not with noise, but with understanding, because perfection had not been protected by status. It had been corrected by someone no one had thought to see. And for the first time that day, Victor Laurent did not move at all. No one applauded, not at first, because the moment did not feel like a performance. It felt like something far more unsettling, a quiet correction of reality itself, and the restored ticking of the watch echoed softly through the room, each precise movement landing heavier than any words could, and Victor Laurent remained still, his eyes fixed on the timepiece now resting perfectly in his hand, as if trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he believed about mastery, about reputation, about the invisible hierarchy that had always placed him at the top, and around him, the crowd shifted, not loudly, but undeniably, the subtle realignment of attention that happens when certainty begins to crumble, when admiration hesitates and curiosity takes its place, and the same eyes that had dismissed Ethan moments ago now lingered on him with a different kind of focus, one that did not come from status, but from something far rarer, undeniable proof, and Ethan did not step forward to claim it. He did not lift his chin or search for validation. He simply stood where he was, his hands relaxed at his sides, as if the outcome had never been in question, as if fixing something broken was not extraordinary, but expected, and that quiet confidence unsettled the room even more than the failure had, because it did not ask for recognition, it existed without it, and Victor finally moved, slowly, deliberately, turning the watch under the light, examining the flawless motion of its inner mechanics, the steady rhythm that had returned without flaw, and there, in the reflection of polished steel and glass, something shifted in his expression, not humiliation, not anger, but something deeper, something quieter, the recognition of an error that could not be explained away. And when he looked up again, his gaze did not carry the same dismissive edge. It was sharper now, more searching, as if he were looking past Ethan's worn jacket, past the surface details that had once defined his judgment, trying to understand what he had missed, and the room waited, because this was the moment that mattered, not the repair, but the response, the way power reacts when it is challenged and quietly undone. And Victor took a slow step forward, closing the distance that had once separated them, the distance built on assumption and reinforced by status. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, more measured, stripped of the effortless superiority it had carried before. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, and the question did not sound like a test. It sounded like an admission, and Ethan met his gaze without hesitation, without arrogance, simply answering with the same calm clarity that had guided his hands, watching what others overlook. And the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, because they were not dramatic, they were not crafted to impress, they were simple, and in their simplicity, they revealed something the entire room had just witnessed, that brilliance does not always arrive announced, that mastery does not always wear the right suit. And Victor held that answer for a moment, letting it sit in the space between them, and then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but to Ethan, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, but in a room like this, it carried more meaning than applause ever could, because for the first time that day, the man who defined time had just been taught something about it. The room did not return to normal, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be polished back into place or explained away with reputation, and the ticking of the restored watch continued, steady and precise. But now it carried a different meaning, not just proof of craftsmanship, but proof that perfection is fragile when it is built on assumption, and the guests, dressed in tailored confidence and quiet authority, no longer looked at Victor Laurent the same way, not with doubt, but with a subtle awareness that even the highest mastery has limits, and more importantly, that those limits can be revealed by someone they almost did not see. And Ethan Cole remained where he stood, neither stepping forward nor retreating, as if the moment did not belong to him, as if it had simply passed through him on its way to revealing something larger, and a representative from one of the major collectors. A man who had been silent until now, leaned closer to the stage, his voice careful but unmistakably curious. That adjustment, it was not in the original design, was it? And the question hung in the air, not accusatory, but precise, the kind that demands truth without raising its voice. And Victor did not answer immediately, because the answer was not simple, not something that could be delivered with the same ease as his earlier confidence, and for a moment, he turned the watch again under the light, examining the alignment, the corrected motion, the subtle shift that had restored its rhythm, and in that reflection, he saw it clearly, the flaw that had been overlooked, not by lack of intelligence, but by the quiet arrogance that comes with believing nothing has been missed. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of performance. "No," he said, and the single word carried more weight than any explanation could, and a ripple moved through the crowd again, not loud, but deeper this time, because they understood what that meant. That perfection had not only failed, it had required correction from outside the circle that defined it, and Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, not out of submission, but out of habit, the instinct of someone who had spent years working in places where recognition was unnecessary, where the work itself was the only measure that mattered. And Victor watched him, really watched him now, as if trying to trace the path that had led to this moment, the quiet hours, the unnoticed details, the discipline that does not seek applause. And there was something else in his expression now, something that had not been there before. Respect, not given easily, not offered lightly, but undeniable. And he took a step back, not to reclaim distance, but to create space, a gesture that subtly shifted the balance of the stage, no longer a platform for one, but a shared ground. And the cameras captured it all, the silence, the recalibration of power, the unspoken acknowledgement that had just taken place. And somewhere in the back of the room, a soft murmur began, not laughter this time, but conversation, speculation, the early formation of a new narrative that would travel far beyond this hall, because moments like this do not stay contained. They move, they grow, they redefine, and Ethan, still standing with the same quiet composure, seemed almost untouched by it, as if the noise of recognition had yet to reach him, or perhaps never would. And Victor held the watch one last time, feeling its steady pulse, before placing it carefully on the velvet display, not as a symbol of his mastery, but as a reminder of something far more humbling. That time, no matter how precisely measured, always reveals what we fail to see. The energy in the room did not fade. It transformed, settling into something quieter but far more powerful, the kind of atmosphere that lingers long after the moment has passed. And as conversations began to rise in hushed tones, no longer dismissive but curious, the distance between observer and participant seemed to dissolve, because everyone there had just witnessed something they could not easily categorize. Not a spectacle, not a performance, but a quiet correction of everything they thought they understood about mastery and worth. And Victor Laurent stood beside the velvet display, his posture still composed, but no longer untouched, as if the moment had left an imprint that could not be seen, only felt. And he glanced once more at the watch, its steady ticking now almost symbolic, not just of time restored, but of perspective shifted. And then his gaze moved back to Ethan, who had already begun to step away from the stage, not waiting for acknowledgement, not seeking recognition, simply returning to the edges where he had always existed, where people like him were expected to remain, unnoticed and unchallenging. And that movement, that quiet retreat, caught Victor's attention more than the repair itself, because it revealed something deeper, that Ethan had not stepped forward for validation, he had stepped forward because something needed to be fixed, and now that it was, there was no reason to stay. And Victor took a step after him, a subtle motion, but enough to shift the attention of those still watching. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the space with a clarity that no longer relied on authority. "Ethan," he said, using his name for the first time, and the simple act of saying it seemed to redraw the lines of the room, because names are not given lightly in places like this. They are recognized, earned, acknowledged. And Ethan paused, turning slightly, his expression unchanged, calm, attentive, as if this moment was no different from the one before it. And Victor continued, not with a command, but with something far rarer, an invitation. "Stay," he said, and the word held no force, only sincerity, an offer that carried weight not because of who spoke it, but because of what had just been witnessed. And the room grew still again, not in tension this time, but in anticipation, because this was the second turning point, not of skill, but of choice. And Ethan looked at Victor for a moment, not measuring the man, but understanding him, seeing beyond the tailored suit and the legacy of precision to the quiet shift that had taken place beneath it, and for a brief second, the two stood in a space that no longer belonged to hierarchy, but to mutual recognition, and then Ethan gave a small nod, not of submission, but of acknowledgement, and stepped back toward the stage, not as an outsider this time, but as someone who had already changed the room simply by seeing what others had missed. And as he returned, the conversation softened again, the attention refocused, because what had begun as a moment of doubt had become something far more enduring, a reminder that true precision is not defined by where you stand, but by what you are able to see. And in that quiet, recalibrated space, the ticking of the watch continued, steady, unwavering, marking not just time, but the moment everything shifted. The shift was no longer subtle. It had settled into the room like a new standard, quiet but undeniable. And as Ethan stepped back onto the stage, the space that had once separated him from everyone else seemed to dissolve completely, not because the room had changed its rules, but because those rules had just been proven incomplete, and Victor Laurent stood beside him now, not above, not ahead, but beside, his posture still refined, but no longer distant, and for a moment, neither man spoke, allowing the silence to carry the weight of what had just happened, the kind of silence that does not demand attention, but earns it. And the watch, resting between them on the velvet display, continued its steady rhythm, each tick a quiet affirmation of something restored, something corrected without spectacle. And Victor finally turned slightly toward Ethan, his gaze thoughtful, no longer searching for flaws, but for understanding. "You saw it instantly," he said, not as a challenge, but as an observation, and Ethan's response came just as calmly. It was not hidden, it was just overlooked, and the simplicity of the answer landed with more force than any technical explanation could have, because it spoke to something deeper than mechanics, something that extended beyond watches and into the way people saw, or failed to see, what was right in front of them. And a few of the engineers standing nearby exchanged glances, their earlier confidence replaced with a quiet humility, as if recalibrating not just their knowledge, but their perspective. And Victor nodded once, slowly, absorbing the words, and then he did something that no one in the room had expected. He stepped back half a pace, creating space again, but this time not to separate, but to present, a subtle gesture that shifted the focus entirely. "Explain it," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, not commanding, but inviting, and all eyes turned to Ethan, not with skepticism now, but with genuine attention, the kind that is given when something has already been proven. And Ethan paused for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but to gather the simplest way to say what needed to be said, because complexity had never been his language, clarity had. And when he spoke, his voice remained steady, unforced. The secondary gear was compensating for a misalignment caused during assembly, not design. So every adjustment you made increased the strain instead of relieving it. And as he spoke, he reached toward the watch again, not to fix, but to show. His movements precise but unhurried, guiding their attention to the exact point where the flaw had lived, invisible to those who had not been looking for it. And the crowd leaned in once more, not out of tension this time, but out of respect, because they understood now that what they were witnessing was not just skill, but insight, the kind that comes from years of paying attention where others do not. And Victor watched closely, his expression no longer guarded, but open, absorbing every word, every motion, as if learning something fundamental that had been missing. And when Ethan finished, he stepped back again, returning to stillness, as if the explanation had been no more significant than the repair itself. And the room remained quiet for a moment longer, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing left to question. And in that silence, something settled into place, not just in the watch, but in the minds of everyone present. A new understanding that precision is not owned, it is earned, and it can come from anywhere, even from someone who was never meant to be seen. The explanation did not end the moment. It expanded it, stretching the boundaries of what everyone in the room thought they understood. And as Ethan stepped back into stillness once again, the attention did not leave him this time. It stayed, steady and focused, as if the room had collectively decided that what had once been invisible was now impossible to ignore, and Victor Laurent remained quiet for a few seconds longer, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the weight of what had just been revealed. And when he finally moved, it was with a deliberateness that carried none of his earlier sharpness. He reached toward the watch once more, lifting it carefully, not as a demonstration of control, but as a confirmation of what had been restored, and the ticking remained flawless, consistent, each movement aligned with a precision that no longer belonged to a single name, but to the truth of the mechanism itself. And Victor turned slightly toward the audience, his posture still composed, but his presence altered in a way that could not be undone. "There is a difference," he said, his voice steady, measured, between designing perfection and recognizing when it is incomplete, and the words settled over the room with a quiet authority that did not rely on dominance, but on acknowledgement, and a few heads nodded subtly, not in agreement alone, but in understanding, because what they had witnessed was no longer just a correction of a watch, it was a correction of perspective. And Victor then looked back at Ethan, his gaze direct, no longer filtered through assumption. "Most people in this room," he continued, "would have trusted the design, trusted the process, trusted me. And there was no arrogance in the statement, only clarity, but you trusted what you saw." And that distinction hung in the air, drawing a line between belief and observation, between reputation and reality. And Ethan did not respond immediately, his expression unchanged, as if the recognition, while significant to others, did not alter the way he understood his own role. And when he finally spoke, his voice remained simple, grounded. "The watch does not care who made it. It only responds to what is done to it." And the sentence carried a quiet finality, the kind that does not invite debate, only reflection, and the room absorbed it fully this time. Not as a clever remark, but as a principle, something that extended far beyond the glass cases and polished displays. And Victor gave a small nod again, more visible now, not just to Ethan, but to the truth in his words. And for a brief moment, the two men stood in complete alignment, not in status, but in understanding. And somewhere near the front, one of the collectors raised a hand slightly, breaking the silence with a question that had been forming since the repair. "Was it preventable?" he asked, his tone careful, aware of the significance of the answer. And Victor glanced at Ethan before responding, a subtle gesture that acknowledged the shift in authority. And Ethan spoke first this time, his voice steady. "Yes, if someone had looked closely enough." And the answer, simple as it was, settled into the room like a quiet truth no one could avoid. And the implication lingered, not accusatory, but revealing, because it suggested that the flaw had never been truly hidden, only overlooked. And in that realization, the entire room seemed to recalibrate once more, not in discomfort, but in awareness. And the ticking of the watch continued, unchanged, steady, marking not just time, but the moment when seeing became more valuable than knowing. The question did not fade after it was answered. It lingered, echoing softly in the minds of those who had spent years trusting systems over sight. And the quiet admission that something preventable had been missed settled into the room, with a weight far greater than any failure, because it revealed not a lack of skill, but a lapse in attention, and that was something no title could fully protect against. And Victor Laurent stood in that realization without retreating from it, his posture still, composed, but his presence now carried a different kind of authority, one shaped not by perfection, but by the willingness to recognize its limits. And he turned slightly toward the audience again, his voice steady but softer than before. "Precision is not just about building something flawless," he said. "It is about never assuming that it cannot fail." And the words carried a clarity that resonated beyond the stage, touching something deeper in the room, something that went beyond watches and craftsmanship. And several of the engineers standing nearby lowered their gaze briefly, not in shame, but in thought, as if revisiting their own processes, their own assumptions. And Ethan remained still, his role in the moment complete, his presence unchanged by the shift in attention, as if the recognition did not alter the way he saw himself. And that quiet consistency made him stand out even more, because in a room filled with people who had built identities around achievement, he seemed untouched by it, grounded in something simpler, something steadier. and one of the younger designers, standing near the back, stepped forward hesitantly, his voice careful but genuine. "How do you notice something like that?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a request, and the question carried a sincerity that had not been present earlier in the room. A shift from judgment to curiosity, and Ethan looked at him briefly, then at the watch, as if the answer was already there. "You stop trying to prove that it works," he said, "and you start asking where it might fail." And the simplicity of the statement landed with quiet force, because it reframed the entire approach, turning confidence into inquiry, turning certainty into awareness, and the young designer nodded slowly, absorbing the idea, while others around him did the same. The room no longer divided by status, but united in understanding, and Victor watched this exchange closely, his expression thoughtful, as if recognizing that what had just happened extended far beyond a single correction. It was a lesson, not delivered through authority, but through demonstration, and he turned back to Ethan once more, his voice carrying a quiet finality. "You did not just fix a watch today," he said. "You reminded us what it means to see." And the statement did not feel like praise. It felt like acknowledgement, the kind that holds its weight without needing embellishment, and Ethan gave a small nod, not accepting the recognition as something new, but simply acknowledging that it had been spoken. And for a moment longer, the room remained still, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been understood, and the watch continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, marking the passage of time in a space that had been quietly, irrevocably transformed. The room did not erupt into applause. It settled into something far more profound, a quiet recognition that did not need sound to validate it. And as the final words lingered in the air, the attention that had once been divided by status now rested evenly across the stage, no longer drawn by reputation, but by truth. And Victor Laurent stood still for a moment longer, absorbing not just what had happened, but what it meant, because this was not a moment that could be undone or reframed. It was a moment that redefined. And he reached for the watch once more, lifting it carefully, almost reverently now, as if it had become more than a creation, more than a symbol of his mastery. It had become a reminder, and the steady ticking continued, unwavering, precise, each movement carrying the quiet echo of everything that had just been revealed. And Victor turned toward Ethan again, his expression composed but undeniably changed. "Would you walk with me?" he said, his voice calm, but carrying a different kind of weight now, not authority, but intention. And without waiting for a response, he stepped down from the stage, not away from the moment, but deeper into it, inviting a shift that extended beyond the spotlight. And after a brief pause, Ethan followed, not out of obligation, but out of quiet understanding, and the two moved together through the crowd, not as opposites, but as something newly aligned, their presence parting the space around them in a way that felt less like privilege and more like purpose. And the conversations that had begun to rise fell silent again as they passed, because everyone understood that whatever came next would not be part of the show. It would be something more private, more significant, and they stopped near a smaller display case, away from the cameras, where the light was softer and the reflections less imposing, and Victor placed the watch gently inside, securing it with a careful motion that spoke of respect rather than ownership. And for a moment, he simply stood there, looking at it, before turning back to Ethan, his voice lower now, stripped of any need to perform. "I have spent my life perfecting time," he said. "But today, you reminded me that perfection is not a destination, it is a responsibility." And the words carried no defensiveness, no attempt to reclaim what had been lost, only a clear acknowledgement of something newly understood. And Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, as if the weight of the moment did not need to be carried, only recognized. And Victor continued, more quietly now, "There is a place for what you see," he said. "Not just here, but in everything we build." And the offer was not spoken as a transaction, not framed as an opportunity to be accepted or declined. It was presented as a truth, something that had already been established by what had happened. And Ethan looked at him for a moment, considering not the words, but the intention behind them. And then he glanced back at the watch, its steady rhythm reflecting softly in the glass, before returning his gaze to Victor. "Then do not let it be overlooked again," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. And the simplicity of the answer carried a quiet finality, because it did not ask for a position or recognition or reward. It asked for awareness, for change, for the kind of attention that prevents the same mistake from happening again. And Victor nodded slowly, understanding fully, not just the words, but the responsibility within them. And for a moment, the two men stood in silence once more, not as strangers divided by status, but as equals connected by something far more enduring, a shared recognition that true precision is not about control, but about clarity. And in that quiet corner of the expo, far from the stage and the cameras, the most important shift of the day had just taken place, not in what was fixed, but in how it would be seen from that moment forward. The quiet corner where they stood seemed untouched by the lingering noise of the expo, as if the world beyond the glass cases and polished floors had slowed just enough to allow something more important to take shape. And Victor Laurent remained still for a moment after Ethan's words, letting them settle fully, not as a passing remark, but as a directive, something to be carried forward rather than admired in the moment. And he gave a slight nod again, not out of habit, but out of understanding, a gesture that felt less like agreement and more like acceptance of a responsibility that had been clearly placed before him. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that had replaced the sharp precision it once held. "It will not be," he said, and there was no need to elaborate, because the weight of the promise was already evident in the way he stood, in the way he looked at the watch, in the way he now looked at Ethan, not as someone outside the circle, but as someone who had already changed its boundaries, and a few steps away, beyond the softer lighting. The murmurs of the crowd had begun to rise again, but they were different now, not filled with speculation or quiet amusement, but with reflection, as if each person had taken a piece of what they had witnessed and was turning it over carefully, measuring it against their own understanding, their own assumptions. And Victor glanced briefly toward the main floor, then back to Ethan, as if aware that the moment could not remain hidden for long, that what had happened here would soon ripple outward, shaping conversations, altering perceptions, redefining expectations. And yet he did not rush to return. He did not move to reclaim the center of attention. Instead, he stayed where he was, choosing to let the shift take root before stepping back into the light. And that choice alone spoke volumes, because it revealed a change not just in what he had seen, but in how he intended to move forward. And Ethan stood quietly beside him, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, as if the environment around him had transformed, but his purpose had not. And there was a steadiness in that, something grounding, something that made the moment feel complete rather than fleeting. And Victor turned slightly, his gaze thoughtful. "You do not chase recognition," he said, not as a question, but as an observation drawn from everything he had just witnessed. And Ethan's response came just as simply. "Recognition does not change the work." And the words carried a quiet clarity that left no room for interpretation, because they were not meant to impress, only to state what had always been true for him. And Victor allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to form, not one of superiority, but one of appreciation, the kind that comes from encountering something rare and genuine. And he gave a small nod once more, as if confirming something to himself, before glancing again toward the main floor, where the attention was beginning to shift back, where the rhythm of the event was slowly reassembling itself around the absence of the moment that had just taken place. And yet, even as the noise began to return, something remained altered, something that could not be undone, because it had not been imposed, it had been revealed. And Victor finally took a step forward, not to leave the moment behind, but to carry it with him. And after a brief pause, Ethan followed, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as someone who had already proven that where he stood was no longer defined by where he had started. And as they moved back toward the center of the expo, the lights seemed no brighter, the displays no more impressive, but the way they were seen had changed, because once something is truly understood, it cannot return to being overlooked. And the steady ticking of the watch, now secured behind glass, continued quietly in the background, marking not just time, but the moment when perception itself had been reset. When they stepped back into the center of the expo, the atmosphere no longer felt the same. Even though the lights still shimmered across glass displays, and the low murmur of wealth and influence filled the air, something quieter had taken hold beneath it all, something that could not be polished or staged, and people began to move differently. Their conversations more measured, their glances more deliberate, as if each person was now aware that what appeared perfect might not always be complete, and Victor Laurent walked with a calm steadiness that no longer needed to assert itself, his presence still commanding, but in a way that invited thought rather than demanded attention, and beside him, Ethan Cole remained unchanged, his pace unhurried, his gaze observant, as if the world had always been this way to him, layered with details others often missed. And as they approached the main display again, a few of the same voices that had once laughed now fell silent, their expressions shifting from certainty to quiet respect, and no one needed to speak for the moment to be understood, because it had already rewritten the room, and Victor paused near the stage, looking out across the crowd that had gathered once more, and for a brief second, the reflection of the chandeliers and the glass cases caught his attention, scattering light in fragments that felt almost symbolic, beautiful, but incomplete unless seen from the right angle, and he turned slightly toward Ethan, his voice low but clear. "Most people spend their lives trying to be seen," he said, "but very few learn how to truly see." And the words did not carry the weight of a speech. They felt more like a realization spoken aloud, something that had been forming quietly and had finally found its place. And Ethan listened without reacting, not because the words lacked meaning, but because he had always lived within them. And when he responded, his voice remained steady, grounded in the same quiet clarity that had guided him from the beginning. "Seeing is not about where you stand," he said. "It is about what you are willing to notice." And the simplicity of the statement settled into the space around them. Not dramatic, not forceful, but lasting, because it did not seek to impress, only to remind. And Victor gave a small nod once more, his expression thoughtful, as if committing the idea to something deeper than memory. And around them, the expo continued. But it no longer felt like a display of perfection. It felt like a place where something had been uncovered, something that would shape the way people approached their work long after the lights dimmed and the doors closed, and a few of the engineers began to return to their stations, their movements quieter, more intentional, as if carrying a new awareness into every detail they touched. And even the collectors, who had once measured value in price and rarity alone, now lingered a little longer at each display, their attention drawn not just to what was presented, but to what might be hidden beneath it. And Ethan stood still for a moment, taking in the subtle shift without claiming it, because it was never his to claim. It was simply the result of seeing clearly when others had not, and Victor remained beside him, not leading, not following, but standing in that shared understanding. And the steady ticking of the watch, now resting behind glass once more, continued quietly in the background, marking time not just as it passed, but as it revealed, reminding everyone within earshot that true precision is not found in perfection alone, but in the willingness to question it. And in that quiet realization, the moment found its place, not as an ending, but as something that would continue to echo long after the room returned to its usual rhythm. The expo slowly returned to its rhythm, but it was no longer the same rhythm that had filled the room before, because something invisible had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be undone by conversation or distraction. And as the lights continued to shimmer across glass and polished steel, the people within that space carried a new awareness with them, one that lingered quietly in the way they observed, in the way they questioned, in the way they listened. And Victor Laurent stood for a moment longer near the display, his reflection faintly visible in the glass beside the restored timepiece, no longer seeing just his own image, but the subtle imperfection that had once gone unnoticed, and more importantly, the moment it had been revealed. And there was no trace of frustration in his expression, only clarity, the kind that comes when something fundamental has been understood. And across the room, Ethan Cole had already begun to move away, not toward recognition, not toward conversation, but toward the quieter edges once again, where his presence did not demand attention, because it never had. And yet now, as he walked, the space around him seemed to shift slightly, not parting out of status, but out of respect, a silent acknowledgement from those who had seen what he could do, and more importantly, how he had done it, without noise, without pride, without the need to be seen. And Victor watched him for a brief moment, not to call him back, not to offer anything more, but simply to recognize the difference. The kind of difference that does not ask to be followed, only understood, and somewhere in the distance, the steady ticking of the watch continued, precise and unwavering. But it no longer felt like the center of the story. It felt like a reminder, a quiet echo of the lesson that had unfolded, that perfection, no matter how refined, is never beyond question, and that true mastery lies not in defending what is built, but in being willing to see when it is incomplete. And the room, filled with people who had spent their lives pursuing excellence, now carried that idea with them, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to look closer, to listen deeper, to question what had always been accepted.